Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. Super excited to have my co-host, Ben Lesh here. And we are interviewing two amazing people in the React community. We are interviewing Jay Phelps. And
hello.
Hi. And we're also interviewing Michael Jackson.
Hey, everybody.
Cool. So just quick, I'll let everybody go ahead and introduce themselves. My name's Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet. Google developer expert, co-founder of a company called This.Labs. Love helping people in general. And, you can always come say hi. What about you, Ben? Who are you?
I am Ben Lesh. I work at Google now. I used to work at Netflix. At Google, I work on the Angular team, and I work on RxJS. At Netflix and in a past life, I worked with React and Ember and Angular 1 and a bunch of other stuff.
And Vue, once.
No, I wouldn't say I worked with Vue. I've played with Vue.
Also,
you played with Vue?
Yeah.
I have RxJS 14 too, so forgot about that. Jay.
Hi.
Who are you?
I am a guy. Yeah, no, I actually now work with Tracy as well at this dot. We do mentoring and architecture and stuff like that. But I used to work at Netflix, which is how I know Ben. And I used to be on the RxJS core team, but I haven't had a whole lot of time, so I had to step down from that. Yeah, that's what I'm doing these days.
And you live in Knoxville.
I do now, yeah. I left the Bay Area. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Oh, no way. That's awesome, Jay. Congrats.
Yeah. Way far away.
I feel like I should congratulate people when they move out of the Bay Area.
Yeah, because they can afford things now.
Like you broke free. You can have money now.
Yeah, great.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael. Michael Jackson is my full name. Michael James Ian Jackson is actually my full name. I live in San Diego, California, actually just north of San Diego, a little place called Carlsbad, with my wife and 4 kids. I am the founder of a company called React Training, reacttraining.com. You can come check us out. We hold React workshops and go around and teach people about React. I also write a lot of open source code, so probably the most well-known piece of code that I wrote is called React Router. And so that's a popular library in the React ecosystem. I also have a couple of, I'm always dabbling in side projects. Probably the biggest side project that I've got going on right now is this thing called Unpkg, which is a website, unpkg.com, which is like a CDN that sits in front of NPM. And it does a lot of traffic. So it's good for like demos and things if you're making code pens or JS fiddles or whatever. So so that's me in a nutshell.
Is RxJS still one of the most downloaded things on the package? Or?
Let me check it out real quick, because it definitely, let's see, right now you are, you're dropping. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You're number 8.
Gotta pump that up.
I mean, you're still in the top 10, which is cool.
Who's number 1?
Yeah, I'm going to kneecap them.
So there's React is the most downloaded package on Unpkg. And then this thing called Leaflet, which is actually for doing like maps
in
the browser. And then React DOM. And then Workbox-SW. I don't even know what that is.
I should download that. Actually, is your thing intelligent enough to like somehow ignore, like if I wrote a script that just requested RxJS 100,000 times every minute? Okay, no,
go for it. You could totally game this. Yeah,
but I know bandwidth isn't free.
Yeah, it's free for us. So the awesome thing about Unpkg is Cloudflare just stepped up and sponsors the project. So they actually gave us a free enterprise level account.
Wow.
And so they just they host all of that traffic. So like last month we did let's see, we did about 7 billion requests, served 82 terabytes of data to over 600 million unique visitors around the world. And Cloudflare just handles all of that like a champ. I think I read somewhere that Cloudflare handles like 10% of all the internet's traffic which just, if that doesn't make your head explode, I don't know what will. It's just massive amounts of data.
Yeah. Well, traffic, like requests or actual bandwidth.
I think bandwidth.
Really? So like between them and Netflix, it's like half the internet.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask actually. Netflix probably built all their own infrastructure for serving stuff like that, right? You guys probably own
for servers themselves.
Anymore, but
AWS, and then except for the video bits are served over these Open Connect appliances, so they're custom hardware OS.
CDNs, they make deals with ISPs and put hardware in them to get the videos closer to everybody.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what should we talk about first? What is the most, this episode is on topics in React, and we have so many exciting things. I mean, Async React, I think maybe we start with that.
Yeah, let's start with that because I literally have no idea what that is. So it's been about a year since I've done any serious React development, and that's all new. And you think that a guy that works in an async library would know more about what was happening in async with React, but I'd like to hear more about it.
Well, they kind of didn't go they didn't go like sort of the traditional route, I guess, that a lot of people would expect. They kind of tried something new, which it's, I think we still have to see how this is all going to play out. So the basic idea of this behind the async API is that you have these things called fetchers, and you have this method essentially called create fetcher, and these are obviously responsible for fetching your data. And then you have these stores which can kind of sit on the client, and those are kind of like your client-side caches. And then you can basically say right inside your render method, you can try and read from one of these stores, and if it misses, then it's going to go and use the fetcher to go and actually do the fetch. And the kind of tricky thing is right there is that it's actually going to throw a promise, right? So in other words, you go to render one of your React components. It goes to try and read some data out of the store. The store says, nope, no data here. Throws a promise up the chain, and then React, that was the one that was rendering that component, catches the promise and says, oh, I see here that you're not quite ready yet. So I'm gonna just wait until this promise resolves, and then I'm gonna know that you are ready to render, so then I can try again.
And Ben, so one of the things is that's hard for people to grok, and it was hard for me to grok, is that he means literally they're throwing a promise as the exception. Like,
what, really?
Yeah. So, and it's basically a poor. It's kind of clever. It's clever. It's not kind of clever. It is clever. Dirty but clever. Like, it's a poor man's algebraic effects. If anyone's like familiar with those algebraic effects, that's like a OCaml thing. Like, it's the fact that the render method is a pure function means you can take advantage of that fact by entering the function, throwing an exception, which means you leave the function right, and then you can enter the function at the very beginning again because it's supposed to be a pure function. So if you enter it again and it uses a caching mechanism, the fact that you could call the render function as many times as you want, and you're always going to get the same data back. Like, basically, the first time you try and render, you're not going to get any data back. You basically throw that effect, or you throw that exception, that promise that's an exception, and so nothing gets rendered. And then after the promise action resolves and you've got the data is then cached and can't be updated. That's also key to it as well, is that you can't
I'm sorry. So the part I'm confused on, so it's when you say throws a promise, it's throwing an actual promise instance, but that promise instance isn't necessarily a rejected promise. It's a promise that's just waiting to resolve.
It is literally exactly that. Like for example, you could say throw new promise. What's that?
Just a clever way to get it to unwind the stack and send it back somewhere like a separate return channel. Basically.
Essentially, so that it's a clever way of making it so that you can declaratively have you can, similarly to how like await fetch, like is declarative, but actually does something different. It's like the same type of way as you'd basically, call your fetcher, your function that he was talking about, and it would actually throw an exception, which that exception would be a promise. And so it declaratively would appear that the data comes back synchronously, but in fact actually doesn't come back at all. It throws an exception to that promise, and that promise then kicks off the actual AJAX request.
That's cool,
it's
but
wild.
Super gross.
It's wild. It's wild. But and at first,
so I think it's interesting because up until now, if anybody who's doing any sort of async stuff in React, they probably got like or data fetching. Let's just say that they probably got like some kind of loading flag, right? So in your state, in your component did mount, you basically say, we need some data, go and do the fetch. And then I've got a piece of state that says, am I fetching or not? And then when I get back from the fetch, then I can say, is loading false? And then in my render method, I can check the flag and say, okay, I'm not loading anymore. Here's the data. So it's essentially, I think, just taking a lot of, like, anybody who's doing any sort of a fetch in a React component right now is using some variant of that pattern. And I think when everybody's doing the same thing, then we call that boilerplate usually. And so I think they're trying to figure out, like, how can we sort of reduce that boilerplate and sort of wrap that up, and yeah, as you said, the throw is just a clever way to sort of unwind the stack and exit the function immediately. But it is, I just think it is interesting because it is a way to, they've identified something that literally everybody is doing and said, okay, how can we make this a little more declarative, and how can we sort of like, abstract this away for people?
That's interesting. The choice of a promise is interesting too, because you'd have to figure there are situations where people wouldn't want to wait for the data to come back. Like, they just don't care anymore. And they wouldn't want to execute the logic to process the data or store it in their cache or whatever it is they're going to do.
Yeah. So there's another side of the API, which again, a lot of this stuff is still like very, very new, and so it's not like usable yet. But there's another piece of it which I was talking to a Facebook core team about this. There's so another piece of the API in React 16.3 is this error boundary API. So if some of your code throws an error, it can bubble up to this sort of like boundary that will catch and render something else. So that's actually a slightly separate conversation, but it's relevant here because when you're throwing these promises, it's like you said, like maybe you don't actually want to wait for the promise. Maybe you just want to render something else if there's a miss, right? So it'd be nice to implement your own sort of custom behavior. So there's actually this idea floating around, and again, no code has actually been like published yet, but the idea is, what if, similar to these error boundaries, what if we had like an asynchronous boundary, right? And so this asynchronous boundary is the place where I can say, look, if, and again, it's just a component. So if anything in the subtree of this asynchronous boundary actually throws one of those promises, it's actually async, we can set a boundary here that kind of governs what we want to do now. Do we want to, maybe it's a timeout. Maybe we only want to wait 200 milliseconds for that promise to resolve. And if it doesn't resolve in 200 milliseconds, render a spinner or render something else entirely. And so the throw, I think, is just part of like the, seriously low level implementation. Again, you don't actually throw, you just say read, and then their code throws for you if you need it. So people don't need to know that it throws. And then you can have a way to sort of declaratively say, okay, given the fact that there is something asynchronous going on, how do we want to handle that?
Interesting. So how would this API then handle something like streaming data? Like say I had some chart that updated once every 5 seconds from push data.
It's to my knowledge, it's not. There's no support. There's no. It's the promise stuff is basically it's going to resolve or it's not going to resolve, and it's going to reject. And my understanding from discussing with. Oh God, I'm trying to remember who I was discussing it with. Someone on the core team, but because I was asking about the problem of aborting, right? So like they were saying that like if you know, like one of the things at the same time they were saying is that they can cancel the async work if, you know, they leave the page or something like that. Or like, you know, let's say you're starting to render something and then they navigate away to a different page, but still within the same app. Right. We want to cancel that work that we were doing. And we not only that, we want to cancel the actual AJAX request. And it's not clear how that's going to work. I did get, based on the demo that they put out, it's not production, right? So there's no, the APIs could change. But based on the demo they put out that I edited, I was able to get abort controller to work with, you know, with like fetch or something like that. But the problem being that, you know, abort, you know, like when you abort a fetch, it actually throws, like, and that's not what you want. You don't want it to be an error, because if it actually has an error, then you have to handle that differently than if there was actually a real error, not a cancellation.
Right. Yeah. And, I mean, it's tricky, like the semantics around promises and abort, like aborted promise, it's promise, it should probably reject. I guess my concern is there's not like a lot of freedom of choice, and obviously like I work on RxJS, so you know I would probably favor observables if given the choice, just familiar.
But the reason why they don't want observables, and I kind of understand, is that then their goal of making it a pure function, a quote unquote pure function. I mean, it's not truly pure, but the fact of like you can call render with the same data multiple times, and you'll either throw the promise, or you'll resolve with the exact same value. That contract can be broken by an observable, because an observable can emit multiple values.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
and it can just update. Now, I honestly think the obsession with making that, I don't know. My gut tells me that the obsession with making it a quote unquote pure function might be a little too dogmatic for in practice type of stuff. Especially as I've gotten, you know, I've had a lot more experience and exposure to Angular, and while there's lots of things that Angular, you know, I don't like or whatever. Like the easeability, like the ability to use observables in their templates directly like that is just, it's so handy. It's so nice. Like there's so many times where that's just so helpful. And
hey, where are you getting your experience from?
What's that?
Where are you getting your Angular experience?
From helping you. Yeah.
That's amazing, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah. So I think in general, though, I just wanted to say one thing about your concern, Ben, about the streams and the observables and things. I think in general, like it doesn't really change. This async stuff doesn't really change how you might consume a stream in a React API. At least that doesn't change how I think about it.
Right, you don't have to use it, right? You just use it.
Well, no, I use streams all the time. I would just say in my componented mount, hook up my stream, and right. Now I'm setting state whenever it emits values and
right. It wouldn't. It's not supported by the new async API. That's apparent. Yeah. It's like promise based, right? But I mean, you can always convert a stream to a promise. It's not something that's impossible to do.
Right. And the fact that, like, okay, so let's say abort controller is the way to go with just, by the way, this whole async API was called suspense, right? Right, Michael? That's the term for it. So like the other thing is that even if the abort controller is the solution, it's pretty annoying to me that we have to explicitly like create an abort controller, you know, handle it in component did on mount to actually, you know, call the abortion process. I hate saying that.
We should figure out a different cancel, right?
Cancellation process.
What's interesting as an async library implementer, it's much easier to implement an async type that you have to pass a token into like that, like an abort signal or something. As far as the internals of a library go, but just as a public API, 90% of the time it's annoying to deal with because you have to create another.
Right. It just seems like if you navigate away from something, it should cancel whatever that request was, like just automatically. I shouldn't have to do a whole lot of ceremony. And I think it was just like maybe observable is not the perfect API, but I think it could be. I mean, like I don't know if they've probably seriously considered it. I would be very shocked if they didn't seriously consider the alternatives and stuff like that. So I'd be interested to hear more about that. Well, like for example, you could have it, even if you could say like it supports observable and it will take one, like it will take the first value and then unsubscribe. So even if you give it a stream, it ain't gonna consume the stream. It's just gonna, you know, take the single value and then unsubscribe.
Right. Given that the Relay team has their own observable that are pretty much the same thing as Rx Observables with an additional unsubscribed notification, you know, I would imagine that it's on the radar at the very least.
Yeah.
I do like so the thing I like the best out of this so far is the idea of a function that instead of a return value throws. Because to me, like I want to implement a whole library that's all it does now. It's like all the functions, they don't return, they throw, and then the return value is actually the error. It'd be like nega JavaScript. Like opposite JavaScript, nega JavaScript. That's nega.js. That's what I'll call it. It's the whole library of things that just throw instead of return.
So I mean, that's just it's funny, but it's also just like an implementation detail,
yeah.
Right? The you know, they're not actually asking people to throw, and they're just kind of like
I'm not making fun. I think it's cool.
yeah.
I've never thought to myself, I'm going to throw something to return. Like it's just never.
Yeah. It's yeah. I think one of the coolest things about it is that they're actually focused on like making async really, really easy for people, right? Like, what if, you know, and designing the states around like what does our app look like? How does our app respond even if the network connection is slow? You know, what if the whole way that we're thinking about async has been like too manual, right? Thinking about it at like this low level with like callbacks and streams and stuff. And what if there's a higher level that we can just say, you know, I need some data. If it's not here, show this other. You know what I'm saying? Like instead of doing like the plumbing myself, because another thing that you can do with this async API, which is I think totally awesome, right? Is they like say for example, and this was in the demo that Dan showed. Say for example, there's you know, I'm in like a master detail view, traditional sort of master detail view, and in the master view, I tap on a link. And it's going to go to the detail, but you know the detail's not quite ready yet. I need to do a fetch, and then I'm scanning down the list, and I see something that's more interesting in the master view, right? Something further down. I could say, oh, you know, I think I'd rather tap on that thing anyway. Like as somebody who's done async, all of a sudden you're like, oh, they already initiated an asynchronous action, and now here they are coming in, you know, and implementing and triggering another asynchronous action. So now we have concurrent fetches essentially. And one of the cool parts about, you know, just sort of delegating this to the framework is the framework can sort of make those decisions for you and say, or at least provide you good defaults. And then you can obviously go in there and tweak those decisions if you don't like them. But, you know, the default in this case, I believe would be to say, oh, you know what? They triggered this other navigation after they triggered that first one. So, you know, when that first one comes back, just forget about it or discard it, or maybe cache the response in case they want to come back to that page. But this, you know, that is now a lower priority update than this other one. So we're actually gonna take this other route. It's kind of like I think the mental model that Dan used in his talk was of like Git branching, right? So here I am on the master branch. I'm going along. I tap that master that navigation item in the master branch, which triggers a fetch. So one more commit onto my master branch, right? And then I actually go and I tap on another item in the master view, and I'm kind of like, it's almost like I'm stepping back one commit and kind of branching and saying, you know what, let's go over here and do a fetch instead and render that UI. And I just think that's, you know, that's really powerful if we can make that, if we can make it so that people don't talk in terms of, you know, promises and callbacks anymore, but instead we talk in terms of, I don't know, it's kind of an abstract thought, but in terms of fetches and timeouts, and I don't actually have to do any of this plumbing.
Yeah,
that'd be nice.
It's weird. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Ember Data. Weirdly enough, like
How so?
they had I don't know, they just had an attempt at having here's this layer that is responsible for fetching all these things, and if you have like a REST API, it just kind of works, and it had built-in caching and things like that. I mean, it's obviously a totally different attempt, but like the higher level concept of having a framework try to remove you having to think about getting like the complexity of promises and callbacks and things like that, and be like, oh, I just wire this thing up in magic, you know, it works, and I say, give me this data, and there it is. So it's interesting. It reminds me of that a little bit, just at a higher level.
Well, I mean, we've already seen React do that to some extent with just with regular, like how it renders DOM, for example, right? So we never actually, you know, for example, when we were using jQuery or whatever you were using before you started using React, you meaning whoever's listening, you know, you might say something like, you know, go and put this div in the page. Okay, now add a click handler to it, right? Whereas React just says, hey, you know what? Just put it just there. You more just sort of declare there is a div in the page with some click behavior on it, right? So if you wanted to, like, let's say you had like a list with a bazillion items on it, and every single item had a click. Well, if you were using jQuery and you were like super smart, you would be like, oh, let's just use event delegation. Right? So instead of putting a click on every single one of the LIs because that's slow, let's just put a click on the list element itself, and then those clicks on the LIs are going to bubble. And so we had to kind of like think back in those days as developers, we had to think about delegating events because we knew that that would be a more efficient way to wire things up, right? And so we were kind of doing this work manually. Well, it turns out that when we just declare, like I could do the exact same thing in React. I could say, here's a list with 1,000 items in it, and every single item has an on-click, except I can put the on-click right on the items themselves because I'm not the one who's actually like attaching those events. It's React that I'm just declaring that I want something to happen when you click on these LIs, and then React actually wires that up for me in the most efficient way afterward, right? So it's no longer my responsibility to optimize so much, and I think you know, whenever we can, if we can get a framework, if we can offload some of that responsibility to optimize to the framework, I think it's a win. And so I think we're just doing that again, except this time instead of for, you know, click behavior and like wiring up events, which React already optimizes for us. They use event delegation under the hood transparently, and probably most of the people who use React don't even realize that that's happening and don't even know what event delegation is. I think they're just trying to make that same sort of stride forward for asynchronous data fetching, right? So because it's such a common thing. So yeah, when you say like it reminds you of Ember Data, I would not be surprised if, you know, like a lot of the problems that they're trying to solve are kind of the same problems that Ember Data was trying to solve. But I think they're probably taking a drastically different approach. I never actually played with Ember Data, so I can't say for sure.
Oh yeah, it is definitely a different approach. Just the higher level concepts.
Yeah. The problems are the same, right? The problems are
frameworks. Like every framework out right now does the thing that you're talking about with event delegation, right? Because that's like the framework that make it so people don't have to think about those things.
Yep.
But I definitely just at a high level, it was just a kind of a blanket statement.
They're solving those same problems, right? It's like, how do I fetch data and not overfetch? How do I you know, how do I control what I'm showing to the user while this asynchronous thing is happening? You know, how do I, you know, cache stuff on the client, you know? Right. So yeah, they're solving all the same problems. But I think, I'm excited to see where it goes personally, just because I've seen how taking the sort of declarative approach to, you know, building DOM has really paid off in spades, just all over the place. And so I'm really interested in this sort of a declarative approach to you know, to fetching. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so let's move on to another exciting thing happening in the React community, which is the context API.
Ooh, yeah.
So, Jay, what are your thoughts? Give us like high level real quick, and then we can.
I'm probably not the best person to give you like the giant high level version of it, because I used it once, but I've played with it a couple times and then actually used it once. So, but the general idea is you create it, like it creates you, it uses the render function stuff, like the hip, passing in a callback as the children for when you're using JSX and you have like a child element inside the JSX, like you can pass an actual callback, a function, as instead of like an HTML element, and they call that a render prop, which Michael can talk more about because he's helped popularize. But yeah, like it's I don't know, Michael, you probably had to explain this because you do the training so much. The API.
Yeah,
you probably explain the API better than I can.
I actually had a hand in kind of inventing this new API. So we were so I gave a talk about this a couple weeks back in Austin at the Austin React meetup, where I told the story about how I first discovered the context API for myself. It was something that, so when we were building React Router a long time ago, we weren't actually, context wasn't documented. Nobody talked about it. It was totally this like secret feature. And we were having a hard time building React Router because the thing about React Router is, it has these components that can live at, all over the tree, right? So you can have these route and these link components. The links, especially is what I was thinking about it at that time, because the routes themselves were, in previous versions of the router, in version 2, they were all sort of in one spot. But the links you can put anywhere in your app, right? And so in order for those links to communicate with the router itself, which is a component that you render all the way up at the top of the hierarchy, you can put as much markup, or you can nest those links as deeply as you want in your app. You can have 100 divs around a link before you finally render a link. So the traditional way of communicating between components in React is to pass props, right? So a parent component can pass props to its children.
Just to disambiguate this problem a little bit, because there's always some, just for our listeners, there's always some confusion. Like, it's not just nested divs. It's the fact that you can have a template that has a component in it that has its own template that has a component in it that has its own template. Yeah. And passing things through those levels. So there's actually there's actually like a multi-dimensional problem here. It's not just a one-dimensional problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can't control the implementation of all. If you've got a router way up here and you've got a link down here, you don't control the implementation of all those other components, right? So how do I know if I give it a prop what it's going to pass down the tree? I can't control that. So yeah, thank you. That was great. And so we were struggling with this problem in React Router, and so I actually went into the React code base and I was like, you know what? I was like, this is just JavaScript. I've monkey patched JavaScript and Ruby and code like a bazillion times. I'm just going to do this for the greater good. I'm going to monkey patch React so that we can build this thing into React Router so that our links can communicate with the router that sits up at the top, so that we can have a communication channel between them. And so this was literally my first dive into the React code base itself. I mean, I had browsed around before, but I was like diving in earnest this time, because I was like, React, it's this big black box to me right now. I'm going to figure out how this thing actually works, and I'm going to hack it. And so I was actually diving through the code, and I started seeing this word context all over the place. Like I saw props and state, and I knew what those were, and I saw refs. And then I'd see this.context, and I'm like, context? Like what in the world is that? So anyway, I asked some of the people on the core team, and they're like, well, it's kind of this thing that, it's not fully baked yet, but we thought, it might be useful for routing.
You're talking about the old context API.
Yeah, the original context API.
That's the only one I've actually used. I haven't used the new one at all. So this is interesting.
The original with the context types and the child context types and get child context and this.context. That was the original API. And when I looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's what we need. And so we actually implemented it in React Router version 2. And it was a huge blunder on my part, because I basically came out and I was like, hey, everybody, like, there's this context API, and in order to use the router, like, we discovered this thing, and in order to use the router, you just have to put context types on your component, and then you can get our context. And people freaked out because they were like, what is this magic? Like, this isn't in the React docs. Like, what are you talking about? And so we quickly learned, like, that can't be part of our public API. Also, there were numerous warnings from the Facebook core team who were like, look, like, we're not so sure about this thing. It doesn't play nicely with should component update. So if you use this API, please don't make it part of your public API. So we had to rethink. And so what we actually did, when I say we, speaking about my business partner, Ryan Florence, and I, we no longer work together, but at the time we were working together. And so we're like, okay, so how could we do this? Well, so the library that we ended up building was called React Broadcast. And so the idea was basically that you would have a broadcast component. And I thought about this broadcast as like kind of like a radio, right? And so like, one station sort of broadcasts a value, and many subscribers can get that value. And so you would have a broadcast component, and you would give it a value prop. And whatever you pass to that value prop over time, you would have these other components called subscribers further down in the tree. And if you rendered one of those, they could use a render prop and get the value from the broadcast out in the render prop and then render with it. And so we were actually playing around with that API. You can actually still go and see it. It's actually a polyfill for the new API, for the new context API, if you're using React 15. And so anyway, I was talking to Andrew Clark, and he's like, yeah, we basically kind of ripped that API from you guys from the React broadcast APIs, because it's slightly different, but it's the same idea. So the new API is you render, instead of calling it broadcast, they called it a provider, but you give it a value prop, and then you create the provider and the consumer in pairs. So you create them statically. So you say create context, and that gives you an object with a provider and a consumer. So now you have these two components that you can use. So the provider can live way up higher in your hierarchy. So in our case, that would be our router, would be a provider of the state, the current state. And then our links would be consumers of that context, right? And so the links would get the consumer. So the provider can put whatever it wants on context. So in the case of React Router, the provider is going to put a method on context that the links can use to affect the URL, right? To push a new entry onto the URL state or replace. And so it's actually kind of been a long process over like the last couple of years, but it was really, really satisfying to see that like, that's something that we had been using that actually kind of made it back into the core of React.
That's interesting. There's another library, I think it's called Unstated. James Kyle wrote that. It looks very similar to this, is what just from my limited amount of research. Like I knew of Unstated, but like the really brief moment I spent looking at the docs.
Yeah, it's the same kind of idea. There's some state that lives in his root component, and then there's and he's using the context API behind the scenes. And then you can basically just set state from anywhere in these children up in the parent, and it'll redistribute the state to everybody who's listening, to all the consumers.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Yeah. What are some?
I mean, it solves the problem of these big, like you were talking about, these trees, and we can't control what happens in between. But sometimes we've got some data that lives way up here, and somebody who needs it way down here. And instead of passing props all the way down, now we just have this context thing. We can put it implicitly on context.
So there's the use case I had for a context type thing in the past was with like charting libraries, where you have a bunch of different components, and there are certain child components that care about the scale of a parent, and they could live somewhere inside of a template, like a parent. So that's kind of why I had played with the old one. But what are some other use cases that our listeners might have for something like context? Because like my gut tells me that 95% of the time you probably should not be playing with this. But
yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, like I would say if you're making some sort of library thing, you might be more likely to, like, if you're making like a really complex table component or something like that, and you have lots of nested, like a virtual table, I mean, you know, where you have like a cell that needs to know the height of the parent or something like that, and I don't know, like, because also another use case for it is like where you might have otherwise used Redux. I don't want to say that it kills Redux, because, you know, some people said that it kills Redux. I don't think it does, because I think that they fundamentally have different pros and cons. Now they have some overlapping, like they do overlap on this in the sense of if the only reason you're using Redux is simply to have props from here get all the way down to here, and that's it. That's the only reason why you're using Redux. Then yeah, Provider probably would have been a better. What's that been?
Right. Yeah, I'm just agreeing. I've seen the whole "it's a Redux killer" thing. And
yeah. I mean, like
if you don't care about having an architecture, then yes, it's a Redux killer.
Yeah. If you don't care at all about the Redux architecture, or if you in fact hate it, like if you hate Redux, but you really just wanted, in which case I would have argued that, like, why are you using Redux to begin with? Because there's other solutions. I mean, like, you could have just, but anyway, neither here nor there. But and you could have used the existing context API for the similar reasons. The only reason why it wasn't used a lot is just because the should component update stuff that Michael was talking about. Like, it's just there's edge cases that can cause issues with that. If you use the old context API, the new context API solves those problems.
I think what you were saying too, Ben, is and what Jay is talking about too is when the use cases for this context API are primarily going to be when you're trying to create stuff that is like highly reusable, right? So the way that I've come to think about it, whenever somebody says like the word library these days, I'm always like, what they really mean is they're trying to build something that's highly reusable. They're trying to build something that a lot of other people can use to solve their problems, as well as, they're trying to generalize something, right? And so I think where context is really useful is like, like Jay was saying, like maybe you want to build a table component that a lot of people are going to use, or maybe you want to build a tabs component or a something, whatever component that lots of different people can use to solve their problems in lots of different ways. I think that's where context becomes really, really useful, because essentially, I delegate control of rendering back to whoever's using my API, which is great. It's something that we learned, like basically everything I know about React, I learned building React Router. Because as soon as we built that thing, like people came in and they were like, oh, but I can't use it to do this. Oh, but I can't use it to do that. And so we had to like make it super general, right? We had to generalize and make it so that everybody could build the stuff that they needed. And one mistake that we made early on was we said, just give us a route and give us a component, and we will go and render that component for you, right? And it's fine. It's fine in the sort of convenient sort of like use case. But when it comes down to it, people want to render their components themselves. And if you take that control away from them and say, here, just let me render your component for you, then they'll say things like, well, what if I need to give it some custom props? Well, now I have to invent a mechanism for them to not just give me the component, but to also pipe through some custom props, because I'm the one who's creating the component. So they're going to have to give me the props that I can pass through to their component as well. So what we're doing here with the context API is we're giving that control back to people and saying, look, we just want to provide you with maybe a little bit of data or a couple of values. And then here's a render prop. Literally render whatever you want. Oh, and by the way, in the tree, in between our provider and our consumer, you can also render whatever you want in there. So we're not trying to put any sort of constraints on what you're building, what you're trying to build. You can build whatever you want. We're just giving you like a bus, like a channel that you can communicate and put some data on. But we delegate all of the control of what to render back to you, which is a huge part of making stuff in React reusable, right? You can't take away rendering from people. You have to give it back.
Right. So I want to talk about render props really quickly. As I've stated, I've been out of React development for about a year, but I remember a time, it was like 3 years ago, while I was working with Jay at Netflix on some React thing, and I was like, hey, Jay, look, you can pass a function as like a child. And he's like, what? You can? Yeah. And like ever since then, there's this thing. So I look at React, and React apps now, if you go and you look at the actual render functions, if you haven't been in it for a year, they look very alien now compared to what they used to, because there's like all these functions inside of functions inside of functions. And if you think about the fact that every component is this
hey Ben, we lost you.
Yeah, you cut out for just a second there, Ben. Say it again. You said functions inside of functions.
You've got all these render props inside of render props now. It's what I've seen in a few React apps now, and
everything's render props these days.
Right. So, but if you think about the fact that components are really these render functions with some other stuff around them, and then that child inside there, the render prop, is really a callback inside of a function. So you've got a function with a callback.
Yep.
What you're seeing inside of render functions now is like a new form of callback hell in a strange way. Like it's true. Like I'm waiting for the next evolution, which is going to be some weird like promise channel based version of this or something.
Well, haven't we already talked about that though? Right?
Yeah.
You know, it's, if you think about render as a function, right, and you think about a render prop as a callback, it's just like me calling some Node API, calling some function, giving it a callback. What do I do with this data, right? You know, the new hotness in Node is async await, right? So if I declare that a function is async, then I can basically what that means is, you know, I can call that function and say await, wait for that function to finish before I go and execute the next line of code, right? Isn't the stuff that we already talked about this morning kind of parallel in that regard? Because I mean, I'm not really, except I don't use async and await. Basically, I in my render function, I'm throwing, and then somewhere further up the tree, I've got my await, which is saying wait for that promise to resolve, right? So, you know, I think we're actually getting. I think you nailed it when you said these render props. They're just another form of callbacks. We're right back in that, you know, that I mean, some people call it callback hell. That mess that we were in with Node, where callbacks inside of callbacks inside of callbacks, and now it's being cleaned up with async await. I think similarly in React, I think we're going to be able to clean up a lot of this. Like everybody's using render props like callbacks now. I think we're going to be able to clean up a lot of that stuff with the async stuff that's coming.
Yeah, I think the only saving grace with the render props is that it's all kind of forced synchronous, right? So you don't have the same problem with error propagation that you might have with a bunch of async callbacks. So at the very least, it's got that going for it. But it does. I was thinking about it the other day, and I thought this is kind of funny. We've got this flying the flying V, as I always like to call it, of render props now.
Everything new is old. Like everything old is new. It's just the same stuff. It's kind of gets recycled.
Right.
Well,
the flying V. I like that. I'm gonna use that. The flying V.
Yeah. Mighty Ducks.
And then you get down to the bottom of it, and you see just like all of the closing. That's the worst part.
Yeah.
Like the function calls at the top of the V. You're like, you can at least kind of follow what's going on. But then you get to the bottom and you have like all the closing bracket, and you're like, I no longer know what's going on.
Well, you know, I was hoping for us to talk about a few more things, like some of the error boundary stuff and some of the deprecations that are going on in React, but we are out of time.
Michael, are you a fast talker?
I'm a super fast talker about this kind of stuff. So here we go. What's that? Ben might know this. What's that like show that they have, or Jay might know this, when they like on Sports Center or something, where they have like 10 seconds to talk about like. Do you know what I'm talking about, Ben?
I do. I don't know what it's called.
When you're at the gym and you're like pumping your iron. You're like, ugh. and they're like, okay, we've got 60 seconds to get through this list of 10 things. Okay, so we've got 1 minute right now to get through this list of things. So so error boundaries. So we actually already touched on those. So error boundaries are basically just this way for you to say, oh my gosh, there was an error in my code. Before, React would be like, it would just kind of spew the error and be like, I can't render, there's something going on. Now you can actually say, hey, if there's an error, like, and you can do it with a component too, which is awesome. So you can put a component in there and say, hey, if there's an error anywhere in the subtree, that the buck stops here, I'm going to catch it and handle it and render something else, right? So basically, all of those places where you had like a, an on error prop in your component, you can now just use an error boundary instead if you want to. Again, the synonym is like or the parallel is like a catch that's way up here, and you've got a bunch of function calls down here. The next thing on the list is deprecations. There's actually a much better blog post than I could ever give about this. Brian Vaughn from the core team wrote on the React blog a post called New Life Cycles and Context API, wherein he talked about the changes that are coming to a lot of the React lifecycles. So instead of component will receive props, you have get derived state from props. A lot of the will methods are going away. One of the great ways that, or one of the great things that they've introduced to help you catch a lot of these deprecations is they have a strict mode component. So this is totally cool. Obviously, the parallel in regular JavaScript is use strict, but now you can just stick this strict mode component in your hierarchy. And again, in the subtree, it'll warn you whenever you're whenever you're using any of those unsafe lifecycle methods anywhere in the subtree, it'll warn you, which I think is totally cool, right? It's like we're using components for everything now, not just for rendering UI, but we're using them for, for data fetching, for, for warning, for catching errors, for warning about deprecated patterns. It's totally awesome. They can also warn about other things, like other sorts of deprecations, like if you're using like the old legacy string refs and stuff like that. And then, the other thing, this last on the list, we already talked about that, the promise cancellation. Ben, you have a lot of influence in the async world. I think you need to use that influence to get rid of this word abort. We're going to use the word cancel instead.
You know what's really bad is I've got an observable proposal for the whatwig that actually uses a board controller.
Yeah. Oh, geez.
Because it already exists in the DOM.
Yeah. You know the hard thing about inventing new terms. I mean, you should probably just go with it, because the hard thing about inventing new terms is people never actually stop using the old one.
Like collapsible and pipeable.
I think.
Like a couple years ago, I was like, isomorphic is dumb. Yeah. I'm gonna write an article and I'm gonna call it Universal JavaScript. And now whenever anybody writes an article and they want to refer to that concept, they say isomorphic / universal.
Right. So here's what I think.
I just added to the pile, right? I didn't replace anything.
To kill abort, this is what you do to kill abort. You get the right people upset about the word abortion, and abort goes away. Because whoever was thinking of that did not really think about it very hard, because that word is like, because ultimately you're like, okay, I'm going to describe what I just did by calling it abort. Yeah. And what did you do?
You turn it into a political thing, is what you're saying. Make it a political process. Clearly, you are a man who is you work at Google, so you probably know a lot about the political process. You had a successful career at Netflix. Me, I'm sort of like this reject. I work on my own now. I obviously know nothing about politics. I'm going to leave that up to you. You seem like you're also much more charismatic than I am. I think you would have much more sort of success getting that through.
I don't know.
I like you. I don't know anybody who doesn't like you, in fact.
I don't like him.
Okay. So we can't abort our children. It's really
no.
Async children.
Okay, so thank you everybody for listening. You can follow Michael Jackson on Twitter at mjackson, Jay Phelps at @_Jay Phelps.
What's up with that?
The underscore?
Phelps.
We've run out of time. But yeah, I know. You should actually steal that. And then you can follow me on Twitter at LadyLate if you like.
Thanks, guys. I love all you guys.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Talk to y'all soon.
Bye.
Thanks.
See ya.
Peace.